Hello, everyone. Welcome to Out of Character, the show where your favorite creators drop out of character for an hour to talk with game designer and host Marc Tassin, that'd be me, about their art, their process, and all the nerdy stuff that inspires them. From the secrets behind the craft to the ins and outs of the business to the games, shows, and books they can't get enough of, it's a unique and candid look at the people who create the stuff you and I love. As always, comments will be open throughout the show, and although I can't make promises, we'll try to pull in as many of those as we can as we go along. So, with all of that said, allow me to introduce our guest for this week, none other than Elizabeth Bear. Hey, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I am great. I am so glad that you could be on the show with us today. So, I
I'm
was
thrilled to be here. Sorry, I was not getting a video feed. Now I am.
excellent.
Um, I'm
We've had technical issues every week, so it's kind of a given at this point. It's kind of our theme. So,
it's all good.
so can you tell folks a little bit about what you create? Tell them about what you do.
I tell lies to strangers for money. I'm a novelist and a short story writer and a little bit of a futurist in my spare time. I used to claim I wasn't a futurist, but people kept paying me for it, so I guess I have to admit it now.
So you got to be. So, I mean, you have written a lot of books. I mean, there's the list is exceptionally long, and the number of short stories you've written is pretty phenomenal. I mean, how did you end up doing this? How did you end up writing? What got you here?
Boy, I mean, failed at everything else I attempted to do. It's the short answer.
Found the thing that
Um,
worked.
Found the thing that worked. Yeah, I always well, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a jockey astrophysicist uh, writer, and I'm too big to be a jockey, and I can't do math. So
That left you with the last one. Well, at least you had a
yeah,
nice spread of things available, right?
yeah, and Dragon Rider, but that it turns out there are technical difficulties with that one too. So.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Well,
But yeah, basically, I did the whole string of ridiculous day jobs while writing on the side, and eventually wound up through a variety of misadventures, unemployed in Las Vegas, and had
I don't
nothing
need to
else to
know.
do
That's
during the
fine.
day. I had taken the dogs to the dog park so often that they were starting to resource guard it. Um, and there's only so much Montel Williams you can watch.
uh,
So I basically started writing full time, and within a year of that opportunity, I had finished my first novel, and within about 3 years, I had actually sold a novel, which was my fourth novel.
wow.
Um, so yeah, so having that space, um, having that space to do that uh, was really, I don't know, sort of a gift from fate, I guess.
hmm So making sure I understand, you said that you sold your fourth novel, meaning you wrote four novels before
Yes,
one of them sold.
yes.
Yeah, I think
I
that's
actually wrote six before one of them sold, but the one that sold was the fourth one. This whole
that's
process takes a really long time, it turns
well,
out.
I think that's part of it, right? Because a lot of folks, it's very hard when you get into any sort of a creative endeavor and you
Yeah.
get your stuff done and you start sending it out there and then nothing happens.
Hmm.
And you wonder, should I be doing this? Am I doing the right thing? I mean, how did you convince yourself to go ahead and write the next one when, when you were getting started with this?
I was very fortunate with the group of uh, friends and uh, fellow aspiring writers that I fell in with.
Mhm.
And a lot of them are people who I still consider very close friends today. Charlie Finley, uh, Sarah Monette, who's also Catherine Addison, Chelsea Polk, um, and we all started writing together. I didn't say we didn't start writing together, but we all sort of started really working on our craft together and in sort of the um, same space, which was
Mhm.
a little bit online chat room, a little bit live journal back when live journal was still a thing.
Right.
And we sort of found each other and we started talking about craft and having these conversations and encouraging one another. And I think having that community of my peers is what really made a difference for me in terms of moving from being somebody who was, finishing some short stories and sending them out occasionally to finishing a novel, setting it aside, writing another novel, going back to the first one, revising it, sending it out to collect rejections, doing, and because it does take an enormous amount of stamina.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it's actually harder now because submissions are easier, which means more people are doing them. Because this was
Mhm.
back in the dim mists of history where you had to print it out and mail it somewhere
Right,
and then
exactly.
not hear anything for 6 to 12 months.
Right. Well, I think that it's an interesting thing for people to think about because I think all everyone sees is the finished success that people end
Yeah.
up with. And they don't see what led to that. They don't see that if they're just starting that it's going to take time and it's going to take
Mhm.
effort and stamina, right? So you can keep going. And support, I think that that's really interesting too. I mean, did you stumble upon this support circle or is it something you sought out?
I was looking for an online community and I found the first thing I found was the old Del Rey online writing workshop.
Mhm.
Um and the mailing, more specifically the mailing list, the listserv. Remember listservs?
Yes.
Um, for the Del Rey online writing workshop, which is where I initially met a whole bunch of people. Um, and that would have been late 2001. And by 2003, I had sort of found the live journal communities. And then by the end of 2003, I actually sold Hammered.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess it was, yeah, it was about a 3-year process from
Yeah,
actually finding this community of people who were really working with intentionality toward publication.
right, because there's
Um,
a lot of people who want to write,
yeah.
but they don't necessarily wanna actually write. I don't know how else to say it, right? I mean, there's a difference between wanting to do it just because you kind of enjoy sitting down to put words on the page and saying, "I wanna get published. I wanna see
Mhm.
my stuff in print. I wanna finish these things and get them out there."
It it requires a shift in how you approach, and when I say you here, I mean me.
Yeah,
It required a shift. This is the first person you, the
yeah.
self distancing you. Uh, so for me, it required a shift in from writing for myself, to thinking about how other people would receive the work, and
Mhm.
also learning how to learn, which is a thing that I had never really learned before then. If it, like they don't eh, 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 they don't teach you how to learn in school. They teach you how to pass tests.
Mhm. Right.
Um, and actually, the process of actually learning something involves trial and error and repetition and practice and making mistakes and finishing things. And then I think one of the most important things that tends to get forgotten is that you can't just keep working on the same thing. You have to
Mhm.
finish the thing or get it as good as you can get it and then abandon it and go on to a harder thing before you can actually really internalize the previous thing that you were trying to learn.
Mhm.
And uh, uh, it can be frustrating and scary because you always feel like you're operating at the edge of your competence or possibly a little bit you're like way out over your skis.
Right.
So,
I think
um,
that's interesting because I think a lot of people feel like that's a feeling that's unique to them, that
yeah,
they're completely making it up as they go along and really beyond what they should be doing. But it seems to be a pretty universal feeling among creative people.
I think it really is, and I think it's because every time you sit down to write a book, it's something different.
Mhm.
Um, like even if you're writing in one of the extremely rigid categories, like category romance or cozy mystery or whatever, where there's a really regimented structure that the books follow, it's like writing a sonnet because you are trying to
Mhm.
take that really regimented structure and make it interesting to people
Yeah.
who have read 20,000 of these.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So, um, it's and I a lot of people will say harsh things about category fiction, and I think it's an art form. As I said, it's like a sonnet, it's a structure,
Yeah.
and it actually presents a whole set of different challenges than writing in a more open world mode, for lack of a better term.
I've always thought the same thing about writing, say, for an existent IP, is that what's hard to do is to write that existent IP constrained by all that came before
Hmm.
and still write a really interesting story versus what's easy to do is just smash everything up and do something totally like off the wall. But
Yeah.
it's being constrained in that way. That takes a talent, and to do it over and over and over again, like a lot of these authors can do in those markets, is
Hmm.
pretty fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, look at some of the most popular media properties of our era, like Star Trek and Star Wars.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes you get something that's really disruptive that is part of the canon that
Hmm.
people love, and
Hmm.
then you get something that's really disruptive that people just hate.
Right.
And it's interesting trying to parse out like what the difference in that disruption is, you know? Like can
Hmm.
you um where do you find the thing that people really really like that is not
Yeah.
quite the same thing?
See, and that's the talent that I'm talking about, that difficulty of being able to
Mhm.
narrow in on it. And there's every so often you run across creators that are really, really good at it, right? Like
Yeah.
John Byrne is a comics creator who I think always had an eye for saying, I know exactly what this character is about, and I'm just going to write exactly the right story for that character, and did a really good job of it. That's my opinion, but
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned John Byrne because I've just been watching She-Hulk. So,
uh, yes,
um, speaking of
you know,
a show that's kind of taking the whole superhero thing in a slightly different direction. Oh, hey,
I
look at
think
that.
a lot of people don't realize that the current She-Hulk is really based on this run of comics right here, right? They don't get that that's kind of the inspiration for that show that we're
Oh,
all watching right now.
well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of it.
Yeah.
It's yeah. Um, I just finished. Well, not just finished, but like last year, uh, was reading the single green female run. Like She-Hulk is one of my
Huh.
faves. So I'm like super glad she's got I still own a purple business suit. I'm just putting that out there.
Awesome. That's awesome. Well,
um
the thing I liked about, I've been watching She-Hulk as well, obviously, because I'm a huge fan of those comics. I've got the originals stacked up
yeah.
downstairs, and just loved like when I talk about John Byrne finding the essence of a thing, he did what they're doing in the show, which is dug around for old villains that they're like,
Hmm.
no one's done anything with these guys for a while because they're insane and they don't make any sense. I bet I could write a cool story around them. And he brings them out and turns them into a cool story that you actually care about and want to read.
Yeah. I don't remember. Was he the person who started the fourth wall breaking with her?
He did. That was
I think
exactly
that
it was
yeah, it
that
was him.
series. It
Yeah.
was yeah, and it was that series specifically that did it, where someone taught her how to walk between panels to get places faster at one
Yes, I
point.
remember that. Yeah. Uh
And there was a great scene as well in the old comics where, she met someone who had spent so long out of comics that they started aging because they weren't on screen in the comics, and that's how what determines whether you age or not, is whether you continue to be seen in the comics. I just love that as sort of a weird meta to throw into the universe.
Oh, that is pretty great. The bit I remember is various characters arguing with the artist about how they should be drawn,
Yeah,
which was
exactly.
sort of
Yeah.
a running gag if I recall. I mean, it's been years since I read those. So,
Uh-huh. Oh,
um,
they're great. They're really good. And like I said, the thing I love about it is just, him like finding weird characters like the headsmen, which are these villains that all have weird heads. That's
Yeah.
their thing. Except for one guy who's got a normal head but an ape's body. He's the only headsman who doesn't have a weird head. And so
I remember his run on, I think it was X Factor.
Mhm.
And, going for a deep cut here, but there was this whole thing with X Factor's greatest heroes or greatest
Mhm.
villains, X Factor's greatest villains, who were all people who showed up in like one panel and died because
Right.
the subtext here being X Factor is kind of a bunch of losers who mostly just hang around the clubhouse.
Uh-huh.
And uh, I don't
So
know.
so
I'm
let me
feeling
ask.
very old right now.
Oh, don't worry. We allow people to show their age by the things that they love as they go along. It's completely acceptable. Plus, we live in an age where we can say that everything's coming back around, like She-Hulk's on TV now. So
I
actually,
know.
our ancient knowledge is quite cool. So I think we're good. At
Yeah,
least I declare it.
well,
So,
actually, I
well,
I
what is?
actually did actually somebody about She-Hulk and fourth wall breaking because they were like, "Oh, this
Uh-huh.
is just a Deadpool thing," and I'm like,
Well, actually, let me explain for
"Playing
you.
TV, yeah."
You may want to sit down. So take a moment.
It was
Yes.
yes. I mansplained She-Hulk.
Excellent. So what is it about She-Hulk that you like so much? What is it about the character that is, like, so attractive to you?
I mean, she's so unusual as a superhero on so many fronts. Um, because her identity is public. Um, she is more comfortable as She-Hulk than she is as Jennifer Walters. I mean, this is
Mhm.
not the TV show, the sort of comic book canon.
Yeah.
Um, she embraces her physicality and her emotions in a way that is, I think, one of the powerful things about She-Hulk for um, people who are socialized female
Mhm.
is that we are so trained never to get angry, never to um never to show it if we're angry because we won't be taken seriously, always to kind of smooth things over, always to be nice, to facilitate, to conciliate, to find compromises. And I died with delight in the very first episode of the TV show where Bruce is trying to piss her off. And she's like, "I'm a woman." I spend my entire life with dudes trying to piss me off.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think there's something about that that makes me feel seen, and also she's just really good at her job.
Mhm.
Like, and her job isn't superheroing. Like, superheroing is a hobby. Her job is being a lawyer,
Yeah.
and I really like that presentation. Um, and I mean, I like that she's built on way too many points. I like that this is a character who is smart and sassy and physically very capable and indestructible, and you would never let a player character get away with this because basically she can do anything she wants.
Right.
Um, but she still manages to have emotional vulnerabilities and still manages to have an interesting relationship with the world without being particularly, I don't know, like, 90s superhero traumatized, you
Yes, right.
know?
Right. Well, and I think that all those things, what's interesting is they've done a good job, I think, of capturing those in slightly different ways than in the comics, but in the television show.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's interesting that you pointed out is that, she is good at her job. And I started thinking to myself, and she kept doing it. right? I
Mhm.
think that not only is that true for superheroes, they're always like, well, you got to do this. But I think women in general constantly find themselves either because they're the caregivers for family that get older or whatever, saying you need to choose between these things. You're not allowed to continue to be what you want to be. And I think it's fascinating. She's like going, no, I'm gonna just keep doing what I'm doing because I like it and
I
I'm good
didn't
at it.
Yeah, I didn't spend 4 years in superhero law school.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I like that she integrates those sides of her experience, as a character. So, but yeah, She-Hulk has been a fave of mine since the '90s. Um, I trying to remember where I first encountered her, and it might have been I think there's I think there's an issue of the Avengers where she's kind of drawn smashing through the cover.
Uh-huh.
I think that may have been where I ran into her the first time.
Well, she's a cool character, and I do like that when they came out with her second series, I think the thing that sold me was that she was threatening to go rip up everyone's X-Men if they didn't buy her books. So
Absolutely.
which to anyone, X-Men are popular, but at the time, X-Men ruled the world at the
Oh my
time that this
god.
came out. And so for her to do this, especially because I had the original series too, and it wasn't as good. Um, but that they gave her a second chance. I mean, it's
Yeah.
kind of cool. All the stuff they're coming out with on Disney Plus, it's almost like they're using the television series format to replicate what comics used to do, and they're doing the same thing with Miss Marvel as well. It's
Mhm.
another one that I've been watching. I've really been enjoying. I finished it, I should say, eager to see
I've
what
still
comes
got
next.
I think I've still got 2 episodes, so don't spoil me.
All right, no spoilers. But it's very cool, and I just can't wait for the rest of the stuff they have coming. It's
Yeah.
a kind of a crazy time to be into nerdy stuff. It's like the nirvana of nerddom, the world today.
We caught the car. What do we do now?
I feel like to a certain extent, I kind of feel like we won, just in case anyone wants to know. It's
Yeah.
like back in high school, this stuff was like, oh, you were like an outcast. Now I feel like on we won. We are
I
mainstream.
the the difference in people's faces over the last 20 years when they ask me what I do and I tell them I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. And they used to be
Uh-huh.
like, "Fantasy, you mean like pornography?" And I'm like, "No, like, I would try to find something, like Willow, like
Yeah. Yeah, you had very
and
little to
but
go off
nobody had
of.
seen Willow.
Yeah.
Or
Ladyhawk? I
like,
don't know.
yeah,
I mean,
Lady Hawk, like that TV show Beauty and the Beast, like
uh
that. But and then Lord of the Rings made it much easier because I could just be like, "No, like the Lord of the Rings movies."
Yeah, once those
Um,
hit, it started to
yeah,
that was sort of the tipping point, I feel like, to a certain extent.
and I had the so we were my husband and I were just in Ireland on a writing retreat, like, trying to get our heads back in the game after Worldcon.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and I took a morning to go ride a horse on a beach in Ireland because that is something that I've always wanted to do. And the
Uh-huh.
guy who was leading the tour was like, "Oh, hey, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm a novelist." And he's like, "Oh, what do you write?" And I'm like, "Science fiction and fantasy." And he's like, "Well, are you famous?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm no Neil Gaiman." And he actually laughed because he knew who Neil Gaiman was, which again, 20 years ago would
Uh-huh.
not have happened. Um, and, kudos to Neil for that, good for him, but yeah,
Uh-huh.
now he's famous enough to be the punchline of my jokes about how I'm not famous, which is great, it's very convenient.
Nice. Well, I appreciate that he's willing to do that for you. That's good.
Yeah,
That's excellent. So, it actually made me wanna ask you about something, is that a lot of authors write science fiction or fantasy.
Mhm.
You write science fiction and fantasy, and sometimes going back and forth between them as you're putting out books. How did that come about? How is it you ended up being both science fiction and a fantasy author?
I'm bad at branding.
That's
I
fair.
mean,
Fair.
if I'd been sensible about it, I probably would have established different pseudonyms,
Mm,
for 2 2 different career tracks,
yeah.
but, I mean, I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy, and I feel like they're kind of in the same spot in the bookstore, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
And I personally don't find them all that different. Like I generally, within when I'm talking to people within genre, pardon me, prefer the term speculative fiction.
Yeah.
Just because it lets me because it also encompasses horror, and it encompasses sort of limerent fiction, slipstream. Like there's um a whole set of things where uh they all kind of play together and play with a lot of the same tropes and techniques, and
Mhm.
get the reader to play a bunch of the same games. And there's always, like there's always a certain contingent of people who are like, oh, science fiction is better than fantasy. Oh, fantasy is better than science fiction. I'm like,
Right.
why can't they both? Por qué no los dos? Um, and I do like the construction, and I think this might be Roger Zelazny's, but I'm not 100% certain that science fiction is a subset of fantasy that posits that the fantastic has to follow the rules of physics as we understand them, with certain well-defined exceptions. And I'm paraphrasing wildly,
Yeah.
um, because like time travel counts as science fiction,
Mhm.
even though we don't have any proof that time travel is possible,
Right.
um, and a lot of evidence that it probably isn't. Uh, so, and for a long time, like psionics counted as science fiction, largely because Campbell said they did. Um, and teleportation, or one that's really popular right now that we have no evidence is possible, is uploading people's brains, right?
Mhm.
Or I should say uploading their minds. There's uploading their brains, you'd have to slice them really thin, and then
Right,
anyway.
right.
um but that's currently a thing that science fiction is really obsessed with, is this whole
Mhm.
concept of uploading yourself. um so where it's Clark's law, right? Any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from any sufficiently advanced science
Yes.
is indistinguishable from magic, and vice versa. I ruined my own joke.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so good at this.
Well, I think that what is really interesting to think about there, though, is that everything that you think about in science fiction represents a form of magic, but you're explaining it with science as opposed to explaining
Mhm.
it with ley lines and and arcane concepts. You're
Yeah.
explaining it with something that is a little easier for people to believe in,
Mhm.
even though in many cases there's no more evidence that it's effective or would work than say astral projection, right?
Yeah, like it's Star Trek. What is reversing the polarity? It's basically
Yeah.
saying abracadabra.
Exactly. Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, in my own work, I actually really enjoy writing magicians and uh, wizards, for lack of a better term. I like
Mhm.
writing wizards who operate very much like scientists. Like they figure out how stuff works. They have protocols. They like know basically they have established the patterns, because if you did have a form of energy manipulation that was repeatable, and could be experimentally duplicated and taught, you would treat it like a science.
Yep.
It would more or less be a science. um and like every time I stick my hand in this jar with this electric eel, I get shocked.
Mhm.
Obviously something is going on here. uh every time I send somebody into this basilisk's lair, they get turned to stone. Obviously, something is going on here.
Right. Well, I'm you're speaking to the preaching to the choir here. I mean, that's one of the things that I absolutely love about Magic. In fact, when we did new rules for our game system that we put out, it that was one of the things we wanted to do is have wizards be able to be like this sort of collegiate, research oriented, repeatable, how does it work, understanding it, so people who actually spend their entire lives figuring out how it works, the same way the alchemists did in our own world, right, who basically built a lot of science, but just this idea that you would sit down and you'd be like, all right, let's try that spell again, but do it this way. Let's try that
Right.
spell again, but do it this way. And it's slowly over time they'd record that, and it wouldn't just be sort of a wishy-washy kind of do it sort of a thing.
Yeah. Actually, I just finished reading, well, like last month, finished reading R.F. Kuang's Babel,
Hmm.
which very much treats magic in that fashion. Like there were very strict rules for how it works. And her protagonists are essentially linguists trying to figure out how to craft spells using a very regimented set of techniques.
Hmm.
Um, and I found that super interesting, um, especially given how you're a speedy Googler there. um, Especially given how often, I mean, and I've certainly also written books where magic is kind of vibes or hand wavium or,
Yeah.
uh, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it was also super interesting to read a book where things were, okay, this is how it works. This is the only way it works.
Hmm.
This is, it's a technology and it's treated as a technology. And I love it. I love seeing it when that happens.
Well, and I think one of the things that I love about it is I like seeing sort of exploring in my mind, where does that take you over hundreds, thousands of years? Where if
Mhm.
you treat it as a technology, where does it end up? And I don't think it necessarily ends up in like the Piers Anthony Intimations of Immortality type books, although I loved all those and those are a blast. But I do think that it's fun at that point, and whether we would even recognize magic as magic in a advanced society using it in a scientific way.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it would be indistinguishable from a science because it's just that that's how the laws of nature would work.
Yeah.
Um, oh, I'm trying to think of. No, I lost it. Never mind.
Okay. Well, so I do want to ask you about something else. Is that one of the things I noticed when I was looking through the list of books that you've published is that the dates aren't like this series goes year, 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 and the next series goes year, year, year. It's like this series year, then the next year there's a book from this series, and the next year there's a book from this series, and the next year there's a book from this series. Are they actually writing things in a non-consecutive fashion like that?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it's how the publication schedule's worked out.
Hmm.
Like ideally what I love to do is like sit down, and if I'm writing a trilogy, it is great to be able to just power through and write the whole thing.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Um, because you can stay in the headspace and stay with the characters and you don't have to like re-immerse yourself in the world building. Um, but often, and some of that is just that I needed to have more than one contract going to survive because middlist writers don't get paid a lot of money. Um, so
That's fair.
I would have, so I would have two different publishers. So I would be writing a book about every 9 months.
Hmm.
Um, so I would have, like a book out in 2012 and then maybe two out in 2013 and then one out in 2014 and so forth. And that was going pretty well until like I hit a wall in 2015.
Hmm.
And I had a family, couple of actually two or three family crises,
Hmm.
including one of my parents getting very sick. And uh, then in 2016, and I had some real physical health issues.
Mhm.
Um, and in 2016, I got married, and my husband moved cross country, and then there was some weird thing that happened in November that was very sort of threw everybody off there. um, and a friend of mine died unexpectedly, and then it's just been like scrambling, you know. So between my own physical stuff and family stuff and the external stuff, I really hit a wall and have slowed down a lot. And I'm kind of trying to get my mojo back. Um,
Yeah.
but I also started writing more complicated things, and they take longer, it turns
Mhm.
out. Like the white space books. Um, I mean, they're great big chonkin books, and they
Uh,
took uh, took a lot longer to write than like a little 90,000 word epic fantasy.
yeah.
That's like Machine is roughly the length of, I don't know, like two of my early novels,
Oh,
maybe
wow.
like 1.75. So yeah, so and has a lot more stuff going on in it.
Well,
A
that's what I
much
was
more
gonna say. It's not
complicated
just
through
more
line.
words, right? I mean, that means
Yeah.
more complexity, more story, more
Hmm.
m motion going on in the whole
Yeah,
thing.
more consequences, more trying to keep it interesting, more world building, more
Mhm.
philosophy. It's sort of a joke that um, when I when I published the Jenny Casey books, Hammered, Scarred Down, and World Wired,
Mhm.
uh, in well, I mean, I wrote them almost 20 years ago. Uh, the When they first came out, a bunch of people called them Heinleinian, and I thought that was really odd because they didn't feel Heinleinian to me, and I was a big
Mhm.
Heinlein fan. Um, like I even read the bad ones when I was a teenager. You know, like Farm of
Uh,
the Freehold, I've read it. So, um, and so what I was like coming up with the idea for the White Space books, I'm like, I'm actually gonna write a Heinleinian space opera. It's gonna be people in a spaceship talking about philosophy for
uh-huh.
500 pages. Suck it.
That is awesome. That is aw is that what it says on the back of the book, the blurb? It's
Yeah, yeah. It's people in a spaceship talking about philosophy for 500 pages. Suck it. Also pirates.
there you go.
Also pirates.
Nice.
Um, but yeah, and nobody has called those Heinleinian. I don't know. I think people don't remember what Heinlein actually was writing.
Uh-huh.
Uh, or they only remember like the I don't know, the actiony parts.
Uh-huh.
But
Not just people in spaceships talking philosophy, so
not the people in spaceships talking philosophy, or people sitting around poolside talking philosophy. You know, it's like,
so tell folks what, the white space books. How many of these? There's 3 of them, is that correct?
there are two written. I'm working on the third
You're
one.
working, okay.
Yeah, it's I've got 80,000 words, and I've realized that I need to go back and put some detectiving into the middle.
And
Like every time I keep getting to this point where I'm like, I'm ready to start writing the end game and climax, then I'm like, oh crud, I forgot a plot thread. Uh,
Uh-huh. I know that
maybe I'd
feeling.
better actually write these scenes. Yeah. So um, but yeah,
So
that one was actually supposed to be handed in quite a while ago, but everybody's a little behind right now.
right? And sometimes, I don't know, I always feel like the whole although it's true writing is a job, I feel like to some extent there's a bit of unrealistic expectation that words make it to the page at a regimented, calculable rate, right? Sometimes they just
Oh,
don't because it's not how it works, I don't think.
I feel like in some ways, um, internet hustle culture is really, really toxic to the creative process.
Yeah.
Um, and I certainly for years drove myself super hard and got myself into that like mindset of you have to sit down every day and write 8 pages or whatever. And it turns out that you can kind of make yourself do that, but your
Mhm.
quality starts to slip.
Yeah.
Um, and you also have to come up like the hard part isn't coming up with the words. It turns out that like the words are the easy part. Once you like figure out how to write a coherent sentence with,
Mhm.
maybe some humor in it and a couple of punchy, like visuals and um like that's the easy bit. The hard part is thinking up stuff for your characters to do.
Mhm.
That is not the same stuff you had them do in 6 other books.
Mhm.
Um, so and I tend to write very much the way I used to game master.
Mhm.
So except I'm playing everybody instead of just the NPCs. I'm playing
Right.
the player characters and the NPCs. And so everything is about, okay, character X does this thing, which causes this chain of events to happen. Character Y responds in this way, which causes something else to happen, which makes character Z want to do something. So, I mean, and so my plotting process involves a lot of stops to think about, okay, here's what I would do in this situation.
Mhm.
Now imagine I had better impulse control or worse impulse control, or,
Right.
you know, um, like trying to put myself in the mindset of the particular character. So I kind of role play my way through drafting.
Mhm.
And I often have, like, sometimes I have an outline, sometimes I don't. When I have an outline, I often abandon it. When I don't, sometimes I go back and write one so I can see where I am.
Mhm.
Um, I do not fall neatly into the plotter pantser dichotomy.
Uh-huh.
Uh, whatever tool gets you to the next page is my motto.
Right.
Uh, so when you have that situation where you're kind of moving at coming at things from a character first perspective, sometimes you really have to stop and figure out what happens next.
Mhm.
And sometimes you have to think, okay, what's the universe going to do? Like, where's the
Right.
because uh, sometimes there's an earthquake. Sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes a big rock falls from the sky. Uh,
Yeah, because
random things happen.
everything needs to keep moving if you're sort of myopically zoomed in on just that character and their next step they put forward onto the ground, it
Right.
doesn't tell a story really.
Yeah. Is it going to rain? Is there going to be a hurricane? Is there a solar storm? Does a
Mhm.
volcano explode? Um, I tend to go heavy on the volcanic explosions. I will admit that they're fun.
I don't think there's any complaints about that. I think that's a perfectly acceptable choice.
Go hard on volcanoes. That's my writing advice.
Right. When in doubt, volcano erupts.
Darn tootin'.
So what I'd like to ask is something that I hate when people ask me, but can you just tell us a little bit about what the white space books are about so that folks who are looking for this, I mean, Heinleinian, we know there's the philosophy in the riding on the spaceship. But taking that aside, what else? What are these books about?
So, one of the things that I drew a lot of inspiration from Ian Banks, C.J. Cherry, and James White,
Hmm.
specifically, like the way they write or wrote space opera. Um, and the idea that there's this vast reach of space and a lot of stuff going on and a lot of different stories to tell in different corners of it that may or may not interact specifically. Um, so there are a few continuing characters. There are characters that show up in more than one book. I think there's one major character who one character in both Ancestral Night, which is the first book, and Machine, which is the second book. um, who has a major secondary role in both books.
Hmm.
Uh, and then there's another character who is a major character in the first book and has a very small secondary role in the second book. And in the third book, basically nobody shows up from the first two, but they all have different protagonists. Um, they all have, and they're all about exploring different um, different aspects of the world. I mean, there's some unifying themes. I describe the ideal white space protagonist is STEM lesbians in space. Like I promise you there will always be a STEM lesbian in space.
Yet another word for the back of the book.
There you go, yeah. Um but the protagonist in the first book is a salvager, an engineer. She's out there scraping out a living, um in a sort of rough and tumble, hauling abandoned ships out of wormholes,
Hmm.
and uncorks a cosmic mystery in the process. In the second book, the protagonist is a heavy space rescue trauma surgeon.
Hmm.
Essentially, she's somebody who jumps out of perfectly good spaceships into wrecked ones and tries to extract living bodies from them. Uh, and there's a giant interspecies hospital, which is sort of under siege.
Hmm.
In the third book, my protagonist is a this scientific specialty I've invented, called arc informatist, which is essentially a combination librarian, code hacker, and historian. Somebody whose job it is to extract data from corrupted archives and dig up the deep memory of what we would call the internet,
Hmm.
um, and put this all together and create historical narratives.
Hmm.
Um, and she's off in space on what is essentially a vast archaeological expedition. Uh, and also, there are pirates. The pirates are back.
Well, it's funny that you said archaeological because I was sitting here thinking, so it sounds like a data archaeologist, something that doesn't
Yeah.
really exist, but over time it's going to accrete. You're going to get these layers
Hmm.
of data just sort of building on one another over time. And that stuff down there is going to be hard to get to. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yep. Especially as everything becomes digital.
Hmm.
Um, we talk about like lost recordings from the early days of television, or lost musical recordings, or lost books, lost manuscripts, um, books that we know were published that no copies exist anymore.
Yeah.
So, as you know, fighting bit rot is already a profession and is going to become more of one in the future.
Hmm.
And eventually the last COBOL programmer is going to die.
Hmm. Exactly, right.
And like that, there's that XKCD about the structure of the internet. Have you seen? It's one of my all-time favorites.
Uh-huh.
Um, and there's this towering edifice of like bits and pieces and yada yada, and it all rests on one tiny little block, teetering,
Yeah, that's about right.
somewhere in Kansas. Um, and the more time we spend online, the more of our lives we put online,
Hmm.
the more that data seems accessible and permanent. But then, like, go look at somebody's blog post from 15 years ago and all the dead links and the photographs that aren't there, and um it's so ephemeral.
Yeah, and when people discover that the CD-ROMs, that the cheap ones
Yeah.
that sold at the grocery store that people put their backups on, 20 years later,
Mhm.
they don't work. They're done.
Yep.
You're not gonna put those in. We've even, I work in IT, and we've seen some of those disks, they'll actually just, like, shatter to pieces when they start spinning.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting because, yeah, there is this sense of digital is permanent, but that's not necessarily true. And bits
No.
and pieces get lost and shuffled away.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
fascinating.
I use Dropbox and dual local backups and, various other things, and I've still had stuff that just vanished into the ether, and I have no idea where it went.
Hmm.
Um, Fortunately, never like a novel file I was working on.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah. OpenOffice did eat all my formatting once. That was a bad day.
Oh, no. No. Yeah, I think I've lost a folder of music that I long to get back that I don't
Yeah.
know whatever happened to it, but maybe it's on one of the pieces of media I've got laying around. I don't
Mhm.
know, but what's happening is we are running out of time, which happens every single time we do this because we start talking and things start whisking past. One thing we do every show, and I want to make sure we have time for it,
Mhm.
is we talk about someone who's really cool, who people should check out, and we want to shine a spotlight on. Who is it that you wanted to talk about today?
I have got a great candidate. I want to talk about a musician, and it's good that we were just talking about music. Look,
Yeah,
a
exactly.
segue, a transition. Um,
Perfect.
the Thea Gilmore, who is a singer-songwriter who has been around working for, oh man, like probably 25 years at least,
Hmm.
is not as widely known as I think she should be, and is just brilliant. These and a little bit science fictional.
Hmm.
Writes a bunch of like sort of horror or post-apocalyptic or uh, kind of very dark, moody songs. Absolutely gorgeous lyrics. Could be could be the soundtrack for the graphic novel V for Vendetta. I
Mm.
think some of her work, and also has some really good Christmas songs. Um,
Of course. And by the way,
and by the way, see, I like people who swap genres, even in my consuming art. Um, but is also currently performing under the name Afterlight.
okay,
And I don't know if that's for like Prince is a symbol now for 10 years reasons, or if there's something else going on there. But
okay.
um, yeah, brilliant. Check it out.
Awesome. Well, then everyone's got another person to add to their list. Thea Gilmore. Make sure to check her out, listen to her music. And I'm dark, post-apocalyptic. I think you're ringing all the right bells here for folks that
Moody,
are
yeah,
watching, right? Moody. That's great.
vibes.
Well,
if
we
you're
haven't.
if you're reading Gideon the Ninth, this is the music you should be listening to.
Perfect. Excellent. We've got our soundtrack lined up here, queued up. So awesome. Well, we didn't even get to talk about your Pathfinder game or your
Oh
game
no.
mastering, which I really wanted to. We didn't get to talk about noir, Nordic noir, and
Oh, see, now
moody kind
I'm
of
sad we
shows.
didn't get to the Nordic noir, but
Right, exactly. Look, I'll just put this up because I even had it ready for everyone. So I'll just there. One of the things that we had talked about, but in the meantime, and Trapped, the show also Trapped,
yes.
but unfortunately, we don't have time for any of that tonight. So I'm going to have to thank you for being on the show. This was great. I really had a good time talking, and really appreciate you being part of the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark, and thank you everybody who's watching. It's always a delight to hang out with you for a little while.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later. I'll be with you in just a moment, and let me go ahead and say goodbye to everyone here. Everyone, thank you for watching the show. This has been great. It's been awesome getting to hang out with Elizabeth Bear and talking to her about her books. Um, of course, next week we have another great guest. Carlos Hernandez is coming. He's the author of The Assimilated Cuban's Guide to Quantum Santeria and a number of other books, also creating a tabletop role playing game. So you're going to want to be here next week. We've got some amazing stuff to talk about. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Thea Gilmore, and we will see you next week.